I'm going to be reviewing today the Odyssey by Homer. This is a reread for me. I originally read this way back in 7th grade and have come to reread it now some 30 years later. And of course, this is connected to my reread of the Iliad. So a few months ago, I read the Iliad again, and following that up by rereading the Odyssey. I will link to my review of the Iliad in the description down below. A lot of the things I said about the Iliad are also going to be true for the Odyssey. But then there will also be some differences. I'll try and highlight those as well. I'm also going to try and move through the introductory stuff as quickly as possible because, again, a lot of it's going to be the same as the Iliad, and I think most people already know it. I'm sure most people already know it. Nonetheless, I am aware that there are some people who aren't quite as familiar with these books, depending on where you're from. So I'll try and give some quick background information. So the Iliad is an epic poem about the Trojan War. The Trojan War is a huge event in Greek mythology that comes near the end of the internal chronology in Greek mythology. So it's after kind of the main age of the heroes. It's a generation after the age of the heroes being people like Theseus, Oedipus, Hercules. It's a generation after that generation where there's a big war in Troy, and it's near the end of the chronology of Greek mythology. But then after the Trojan War, there's another huge epic saga about how the heroes get home from the Trojan War. And there are little mini adventures that all the different heroes have. But the most famous of these is, of course, the adventures of Odysseus. And this is called the Odyssey, which, according to Wikipedia, Odyssey means the adventures of Odysseus in Greek. So Odysseus had the longest journey home, the biggest adventure, and he goes on he goes into the land of the giants, and he encounters a witch and a six-headed dragon and a whirlpool, and he goes down to the land of the dead, and there are sirens who lure men to their deaths with their beautiful songs, in the land of the lotus eaters, where there's this magical flower that makes you forget about everything, and all these different adventures in strange and magical lands, very kind of fairy tale-esque, or like Sinbad the Sailor, or the stuff of great stories, and then that's the bulk. That's the story of Odysseus. Both books are attributed to Homer, although that's less historical fact and that's more by tradition. There's been a huge debate ever since about, were both books written by the same man? Was there even a Homer, or was this just oral tradition? Actually, speaking of oral tradition, both of these books also come out of the oral tradition. So there's this huge tapestry of Greek mythology that, before it was written down, came out of the oral tradition. Both the Iliad and the Odyssey are making references to all sorts of other stories. So the Iliad famously starts out right in the middle of the Trojan War. You've got the war is already ongoing. You've got all the Greek heroes, all the Trojan heroes, and if you're like, well, how did this war start? Who are these guys? That all comes out of the oral tradition, which would have been known to its original audience. Of course, nowadays you want to catch yourself up on it by just reading about Greek mythology generally before you start with the Iliad. And the Iliad famously ends before the end of the war, so that there's no Trojan horse in the Iliad. It just ends right in the middle of the war. And the Odyssey, if it was written by the same person, starts out 10 years after the war is already finished. So it's not a direct sequel. There's a huge gap in the middle. And again, the original audience for these books would have known what happens in the middle because they're familiar with the oral tradition. According to Wikipedia, this is something I didn't know until recently, but looked it up on Wikipedia. There was at one time a whole epic cycle of epic poems which had filled in all the gaps between the Iliad and the Odyssey. But if I'm reading that Wikipedia article correctly, and I'll try and remember to leave a link in the description down below to the Wikipedia article on the epic cycle, the Iliad and the Odyssey were the first books that appeared. And then the rest of the epic cycle appeared later to kind of fill in the gaps left by these books. Now, unfortunately, because we've lost so much of ancient literature, we've lost now the rest of the epic cycle. According to Wikipedia, we know what was in these books from references found in other books, but we've lost those poems itself. But yeah, so I guess point being that this isn't a direct sequel to the Iliad, but it does have a number of the same characters, takes place 10 years later, deals with the return journey of Odysseus after the Trojan War, and that there are references throughout it to the return journey of some of the other heroes, but their stories are not fully told in this book. Well, I guess Menelaus, his story is fully told as well. But for example, Agamemnon, the story of Agamemnon is frequently referenced throughout the Odyssey. He was the great king of the Trojan War, and he came home and was killed by his wife. And then his son grew up to take the revenge. And that's a story that's not fully told here. You'd have to go to other sources to find that story. But it's a story that's frequently referenced throughout the Odyssey. And the assumption is that you already know what that story is. Because, again, this was written for an audience, written or composed for an audience that was already familiar with this through the oral tradition. And as I said with the Iliad, because of all that, you would not want to jump into the Odyssey cold. You would want to read this after you had already read several books on Greek mythology generally, so that you would have that background. And as I said with the Iliad, unless you're in school or something like that, it need not be onerous. Just pick up a couple of books on Greek mythology. If you're having fun with it, pick up a couple more. If you'd like to know more about it, then you can work your way up to the Odyssey. But at any point where it stops being fun or interesting for you, just stop reading it would be my suggestion. Okay. Oh, yeah, one more thing, a couple more things. These were both written in ancient Homeric Greek. I think that the form of Greek at that time is named after Homer, which was different, slightly different than the Greek that was used in the Golden Age of Athens, which itself is slightly different than the Greek that was used when the New Testament was written. I believe I've never learned ancient Greece. They were written as epic poems originally, and you can find English translations that will try to preserve the poetic flavor of the original. But you can also find English translations that are written as prose, so written like a novel. And I've always preferred those. I find reading poetry for 300 pages at a stretch to be hard going, so I get prose translation. As you may be able to see, these books, they're very similar in style. They're from the same publisher. I got them because I'm living in Vietnam, and this was just the only translation being sold there, by Arcturus Press. And Arcturus Press, the translation for the Iliad is Samuel Butler, which was written in the 1890s, so old enough to be in the public domain, but incredibly readable. Samuel Butler also did a translation of the Odyssey, which is also in the public domain. You can find it on Project Gutenberg. But Arcturus Press, for reasons that I don't know, opted for a different translation. This is a translation by T.E. Lawrence. And if you're wondering, yes, it is that T.E. Lawrence. Lawrence of Arabia. This is Lawrence of Arabia's translation, which was done in 1932. It is I had no idea. I mean, I don't really. All I know about Lawrence of Arabia is, like most people, what I know from that Peter O'Toole movie. But yeah, amazing to think about what a guy he was. Huh? He led a huge revolt in the Arabic world, reshaped the Middle East, was a messianic figure in the Arab world, and found time to translate the Odyssey, produce his own translation of the Odyssey. And what have I done with my life, huh? Yeah, uh, th- this is the Lawrence of Arabia translation, written in prose. He gives an introduction here, which is interesting, and yeah, sorry, I know my camera is going to show this in mirror image, but maybe you can make that out. Translator's note. I'll maybe reference some of the things he says. He has some interesting opinions about this work he translates. He believes it has some flaws. It talks about a tedious delay of climax, and how the characters are priggish, and stuff like that. But try and talk about that more later. And he does not believe that this is by the same person who wrote the Iliad. He thinks this came from a generation after, a generation that was already familiar with the Iliad. Now, to really talk about the Homeric question with any kind of meaning, whether or not it was the same author with both books, I think you would have to know ancient Greek, so that you would be able to analyze the style. I don't know ancient Greek, but I do feel like these are very different books, and I know I'm reading them by different translators, so that's got to influence things. But maybe I'll talk a little bit more about why I also think they might have been written by different authors, even though don't pay any attention to my opinion because I don't read ancient Greek. Okay, so let's get into this then. It had been so long since I read this that I had really not remembered it very well. This is in contrast to the Iliad. The Iliad really made an impression on me. The Odyssey, and again, by the time I read this, I was already familiar with the story before I picked this up, like I recommend you should be. I had already read children's versions of this story, kind of illustrated picture versions of this. And when I read this in 7th grade, my memory of it, such as it was that I felt like I didn't get a lot out of reading the original Odyssey that I didn't already know from the children's picture book versions of the story. There was just a lot more boring stuff in here, like a lot more boring speeches, and a lot more build up to the confrontation with the suitors, than was in the other retellings of it. And upon rereading it, that is exactly the same impression I have with rereading it. One of the things that I had not entirely realized when I reread this is that almost all of the stuff we associate with the story only happens in chapters 9 to 12. So that there are 24 chapters, often referred to as books, book 1, book 2, but essentially chapters. All the stuff that we associate with the stories happens from chapters 9 to 12. Actually, I should back up again. There's another important detail that I left out, and that's when the Odyssey opens. It opens in the middle of the story. So Odysseus is trapped on the Calypso's island, and then back home in his native kingdom of Ithaca. His son and his wife are assuming he's dead, and they're having trouble with the Suitors, and it's 10 years after the war ended. Events move forward, but then in chapter 9, Odysseus tells his story. So then we get an extended flashback from chapters 9 to chapter 12 with Odysseus giving the flashback to all his journeys. And then from chapter 12, we get back to the present time narrative. I believe the technical literary term for this is in medias res, Latin for in the middle of things. And if I remember correctly from my high school literature classes, because this was done in the Odyssey, this then became the standard template for all subsequent epics to follow. So, like in literary terms, epic doesn't mean the same thing that it means in normal conversation. You know, when you say that movie was so epic, meaning it had, you know, such, I don't know, what does epic mean in normal parlance? It means like a huge story with a lot of emotions and something that's really long, right? But I think in literary terms, there was like, for a while, it was codified what an epic had to be. And I think because of the Odyssey, one of the things is that you have to start out in the middle and then there has to be a flashback. And so the Aeneid by Virgil or Paradise Lost by Milton or I guess all of or most of the subsequent epics written were following that format. I've been watching some booktubers talk about the Odyssey in preparation for this review. I'll try to remember to leave links to their channels. Matthew of Mayberry Book Club and of course Steve Donahue, who's done a couple read-alongs of this book over his channel history. Matthew of Mayberry Book Club made the point that it really feels modern, starting in the middle of the story and then flashing back. And I get what he's saying completely. Like it seems like a thing like Tarantino would do, or that all those kind of Tarantino-esque imitators in the 1990s, where they would just throw you right into the middle of the story, and then all of a sudden you're confused about what's going on, but then there's a flashback that sort of explains everything that's going on. It seems like sort of a new wave cinema type thing to do, but it's not. It's part of the ancient literary tradition. And again, I think the original audience for this book knew these stories already. But anyways, what's interesting about this format is almost everything we normally associate with the Odyssey happens in that flashback, which is chapters 9 to 12. And I've got this Classics Illustrated version of the Odyssey here, which I did a video on earlier this week. And I'll link to that video in the description down below, because in that video, using the pictures in this comic as an aid, tried to give a synopsis of all the fantastic adventures for maybe anyone who isn't aware. And again, I think most people are aware. But the way it's done in Classic Illustrated and the way it's done in most retellings of the Odyssey is the bulk of the story is Odysseus traveling to strange lands and having all these adventures with magical, fantastical creatures. And then he gets home to Ithaca and he has the fight with the Suitors. But that's just kind of like a little bit of a coda at the very end. Now that's not the way it is when you read this in this book here. And this is the point that Steve Donahue made repeatedly in his videos. He says, Steve Donahue, who makes the same point, he says, most people are very surprised to learn that what they think of as the Odyssey is actually only a very small part of this book. What happens is, after Odysseus tells his story, then he gets back to Ithaca, and then there's this long build-up to the confrontation of the Suitors, where Odysseus is going around, he's talking to different people, he's gathering information, he's hearing more and more things about how rude and outrageous the suitors are. He's just getting ready to take his revenge. And that revenge happens in chapter 22 is when the battle takes place. So there's like 10 chapters of build-up there. Now, I mentioned that Lawrence of Arabia had some opinions about this in his introduction. He says, let's see, where is this quote? He says, "Perhaps the tedious delay of the climax through 10 books may be a poor bard's means of prolonging his host's hospitality." So I think this idea is, in the ancient world, these bards would go along singing these stories, and again, it was originally a poem. And I imagine they did a book a night, because you couldn't sing this whole book in one evening, right? So over supper they would sing a book a night, and he wanted to get as many free suppers over it as he could. So instead of having the climax with the suitors having happen right away, we delay it for 10 books, 10 more nights, getting some free food, and then finally you get to the climax at book 22. Yes, so he says the tedious delay of climax through 10 books. So again, he's putting his opinion right there. Steve Donahue, on the other hand, and I hope I'm accurately representing his opinion, otherwise check out the links yourself, thinks that this is a masterful way of building up to the climax. So there's these evil suitors who are just doing all these outrageous things, and you know that in the end they're going to get what's coming to them, but it's building up and building up and building up, so that when you finally get to that climax, it's all the more satisfying. So he thinks that there is artistry in that tedious delay of climax. Now, I'm probably going to reveal my shortcomings by this, but I might be more on Lawrence of Arabia's side. I thought it was a little bit tedious, and I don't know. I'm sure in the original Greek, in fact, funnily enough, the Classics Illustrated version has a little appendix at the back where they talk about the poetic meter in which this book was written, and just the rhythm that was necessary for each line to make a foot, which contains a dactyl, 3 beats per foot, and a spondy with 2 beats. So in the original ancient Greek poem, I'm sure that there's magnificent poetry going on, and the idea, forcing that narrative into that kind of structure where you have a certain amount of beats, I don't know how poets do it. I could never do something like that. So, I'm sure there's a whole level of this that I'm not appreciating. But I'm doing this book at the level of somebody in the 21st century reading a prose translation. There's just a lot of sitting around talking and giving speeches. Okay, now that I've said that, let me go back maybe and highlight some of the interesting things about this book. And there are some interesting things. So as with the Iliad, we do get some insight into the escapades of the gods up at Olympus. Now, it's not as good as the Iliad. In the Iliad, we had all these great scenes of the gods quarreling back and forth and devising plans against each other. which is nowhere near as elaborate as in the Odyssey. But we do get a couple of key scenes. The most memorable one of which is a little scene where the god Hephaestus devises a plan to catch his wife Aphrodite in adulterous liaison with the god Ares, and drops a middle net down on them, which traps them on the bed right where they're in the act, and then the other gods come around. I'm sure I speak for most people when the fascinating thing about Greek mythology is just these gods who are presented as these huge, larger-than-life mortal beings involved in all these domestic squabbles with each other. It's just fascinating to think about. We also, as with the Iliad, we get references to other things in Greek mythology, which is reinforcing this whole idea of what an interconnected tapestry Greek mythology is. Now, once again, this isn't quite as good as the Iliad. The Iliad had more references back to the Age of Heroes, into Hercules, into Seven Against Thebes, and Jason and the Argonauts. Those references were much more integrated into the Iliad. In the Odyssey, we get some of that. A couple references back to Hercules. Like I said, the parallel story of Agamemnon is referenced all through here. So now that's the kind of thing where if you don't know anything about Greek mythology, it would be a barrier to understanding the text. But if you know Greek mythology, and at the risk of repeating myself, you would want to know some Greek mythology before picking this book up. If you know that kind of stuff, it's neat to see the interconnections. But the one thing that this book does that the Iliad cannot do is its focus on domestic life. So the Iliad was all about the war, and we had some conversation between the Greek soldiers at the war camps. We had some conversations about Troy being under siege, but it was all about life during the war. With the Odyssey, we get an insight into what daily life, I guess, was like for ancient Greece. Now, we have to take this with a little bit of a grain of salt. And again, I'm not a scholar on this. I'm just going off what I've read other people say. But at the time which this poem was composed is not the same time that it took place. So the Trojan War happened, I don't know, like about 500 years before this poem was composed. And the oral tradition evolved in the intervening time. So there are scholars talk about things that are in these Homeric poems which date back to an earlier time, but there's kind of like a mishmash of time periods being represented. This is another thing T.E. Lawrence of Arabia mentions in his introduction. He says, Scholius have tried to riddle his technical knowledge. And of course, he does make a hodgepodge of periods. It is the penalty of being pre-archaeological. So, in other words, of course he's going to get the technical details wrong. There was no archaeology in those days. So you couldn't, there's no way of going back to reference how chariots worked back at that time or something like that. But we get all sorts of references to what they were eating and drinking. We get, just little things like how they were closing the door, or how they were making up their bed, or where they hung their clothes before hanging up their clothes. And there was one scene when Telemachus, Odysseus' son, is going to bed, and it describes how the servant carried the torch up to him, and then he had this tunic that was clinging to his body, and he pulled it off, and the maid folded it up neatly and put it up on the peg. And in a way, it's almost too much detail. It's kind of like if you want the story to get moving, you're like, come on, get on with it. I don't need to know how he folded up his clothes before bed. But in another way, these are all just fascinating details of life in ancient Greece. And it's yet another example about how when you read, you are being transported to a time and a place that you would otherwise have no access to at all. So that's why we read, isn't it? So that's interesting to an extent. The other thing, I had completely forgotten this, but they're going on and on and on throughout this book about hospitality. This is something I did not remember. Again, I had remembered the Odyssey as a story about fighting the Cyclops and Circe and the pigs and stuff like that. And I had completely forgotten what a big theme this was through all the book, talking about how important hospitality is and showing hospitality to travelers and the customs of hospitality, where when a stranger comes in, you give them food or drink and then you wait until they've eaten and rested a bit before you ask them questions about where they're from. That's a ritual that comes up multiple times in this book. To a certain extent, I mean, again, it's one of those things, if you're impatient for the story to get going, all these endless speeches about hospitality can get a little bit irritating. But it's also interesting to a certain extent how important this was in that world and what the values of that time were. Now, the big buildup with the suitors. So the thing with the suitors, Will Odysseus has been away. His wife Penelope has been left alone. Everybody assumes Odysseus is dead, so there's a bunch of suitors who want to marry her, and they've all come to Odysseus's house, palace. Although I guess they didn't really have palaces back in those days. I guess it was like a big house, to try and force her to marry one of them. And while she's delaying in the decision, they are drinking all of his wine and eating up all of his cattle and goats, again, hospitality is supposedly very important for these people, so it's a real crime against hospitality. So Odysseus, when he comes back, is going to have his revenge against them. And after this big build-up of 10 chapters, which, depending on how you look at it, is either a tedious delay of climax or a masterful build-up, after those 10 chapters, the hammer does finally fall, and he kind of throws off his disguise and he says, "I am Odysseus," and then he kills them all. Spoiler alert, by the way. Now, this scene of violence is the part of the Odyssey which is the most reminiscent of the Iliad. I mean, the Iliad was like almost all battle scenes like this. In the Odyssey, we only get that one battle scene. And yet, it struck me as different than the Iliad. Because in the Iliad, one of the big things that comes through is there are no good guys or bad guys in this war. There are just people trapped by fate on both sides. So, Achilles is going to his fate to die in the war, and Hector is going to his fate to die in the war, and they're both honorable people, and they both have tragedies, and we are meant to sympathize with Hector throughout this book, even though most of our this book, meaning the Iliad, even though most of our protagonists are on the Greek side of the war. The Odyssey is not messing around with that game. The Odyssey is not trying to get us to feel sympathetic for both sides. There's a bit of pathos when the suitors die, like, they're pleading for their lives and Odysseus kills them anyway. So it's a little bit pathetic. But they're in no way portrayed as kind of honorable people who are just trapped by their role. They are portrayed relentlessly as people who are evil and violating the laws of hospitality and have no redeeming values. And this just gets hit on the head over and over and over again. So there seems to be, to me, much more of a good guy, bad guy dynamic in the Odyssey than there is in the Iliad. Although, I don't know, our quote-unquote good guys, Odysseus and his sons, do some pretty horrific stuff. So let me back up a little bit here and talk about something that I mentioned in my review of the Iliad. I mean, one of the things, I believe I said this in my review of the Iliad, one of the things that's a little bit strange about this book is the juxtaposition between how cruel these men are in war and how emotional they are about every little thing that goes wrong. So Achilles, most notably Achilles, but really all the Greek heroes, when they're fighting against the Trojans, are just merciless. So there are scenes where the Trojans are pleading with them, say, please don't kill me. My father can ransom me. I've got an old father back home I need to take care of. And the Greek heroes just cut them down without any mercy. And you're reading that, and as a modern reader, you're like, ugh. You know, it's putting some immediate distance between you and your ability to sympathize with the hero. But of course, you say to yourself, well, this epic is 3,000 years old. It's from a brutal age of warfare. The values were different back then. You know, I guess people on the battlefield were just cold, hardened killers who were numb to these kind of emotions. Or at the very least, that's what I told myself. But then, these cold, hardened killers in the Iliad are such crybabies. Achilles is crying because he's worried that he's not getting enough respect and honor. They have funeral games at the end with that Achilles puts on, and the Greek heroes are crying when they lose a race, or crying when they don't get the prize that they don't want. There's just all this. They just cry at the drop of the hat, and you're like, what? Well, how can you be that emotional when little things go wrong for you, and then just have no sympathy when you cut somebody else down? And I don't know if this says something about human nature, or maybe this is just one of the conventions of Greek drama. You know, I guess if you're going to have a story and you want the audience to be emotionally invested in what happens to your main characters, you've got to make the characters emotionally invested in what happens to themselves, and maybe that's where the over emotions come from. I don't know. But there's a similar thing going on in the Odyssey, where Odysseus is furious about the injustice being done to him by the suitors, and so weepy and crying about being away from his home, and says such a strong sense about the rights and wrongs being done to him. But then when he's retelling his story home from Troy, one of the things that he tells, and this is one of those little details that doesn't usually get remembered. I had certainly forgotten about this. But right at the beginning of book 9, he said, from Ilion, the wind served me to near Ismarus of the Cicones. I sacked the city and slew them. Now, this is not like the Trojans, where they have like a cause of war, or like this beef with Helen of Troy. The wind just blew him to the city. So because the wind blew him to the city, he and his men just decide to sack the city and kill them. Their wives and wealth we took and divided precisely. Now, in the Samuel Butler translation, I double-checked this on Project Gutenberg to see if it was any less harsh there. In the Samuel Butler translation, it says explicitly, we took their wives for sexual pleasure. And yeah, so then that's right at the beginning of his journeys. And then throughout the rest of his journeys, of course, one misfortune after another happens to him and his crew. But you're thinking, at least I'm thinking to myself, well, why should I feel sorry for you guys? Why do I care if you get home to your wife and kids when you've just killed these other guys and took their wives for sexual pleasure? Now, as always, this is, again, I had the same question all throughout the Iliad, and if you've watched my review of the Iliad, this is something I talked about repeatedly throughout that review. I'm not sure how much of this is me as a modern reader reacting against ancient values, and how much of this is the author itself is maybe... I mean, did the author of the Odyssey, Homer or whoever it was, did he agree with this? Is this supposed to be something that we're supposed to admire about Odysseus, or is the author being deliberately ironic by setting up that little detail there? I don't know. But when we get to the slaughter of the suitors, there is at the end what strikes me as excessive cruelty, and I'm not sure if I'm supposed to if I'm supposed to be appalled by it, or if I'm supposed to feel like, yeah, they got that what was coming from them. Sorry, they got what was coming to them after that long buildup of 10 chapters. But yeah, the most egregious part of it is that there were how many of it? 9 women. 9 of the maidservants of Odysseus had been sleeping with the suitors. So they had sexual relationships with the suitors. And Odysseus and his son Telemachus decide that this is such an affront to them that they're going to kill these 9 maidservants. So they bring them out, and first they make the maidservants clean up all the blood and gore that is on the ground from the slaughter of the suitors, and stack up the bodies. And it says that they didn't want to do it, and they were crying and wailing. So Odysseus had to drive them on to do that. I don't know, with a whip or something. And then they got herded into this room where there was no escape. And Telemachus was instructed to kill them with his sword. But at the last minute, Telemachus changed his mind. He said, I don't want to give a clean death to these women who have betrayed my household. So we're going to give them a painful death by hanging them, and they can die by slow strangulation. It's a little bit unclear, and again, this is something I double-checked with the Samuel Butler translation. But I as a modern reader have no idea if it's more painful to die with the sword than it is to be hanged. But in both translations, it said that the more miserable death is by hanging. So then they're all hanged, and then, sorry, I've got to give a content warning for this next part. This is a little bit graphic, so turn off the video if you don't want to hear this. There's the goat herd who works for Odysseus, who has been friendly with the suitors, Melanthius. He's been tied up earlier in the fight. And Melanthius, they dragged through the entry in the court, sliced his nose and ears with their cruel swords, and tore out his privates, which they fed raw to the dogs. Their spite made them also cut off his hands and feet, after which they rinsed their own hands and rejoined Odysseus in the house. Now, that part just haunts me, and maybe I'm thinking too much about it, because on one level, none of this really happened, right? It's just a story that somebody made up and that... But, for whatever reason, we humans with our brains are evolved to engage with stories as if they really happened. So when you're imagining these things, you almost have the empathy of if you were reading like a real account of it. It's something strange that literature does to us, and I'm sure it has some psychological or evolutionary discussion attached to it. But you know what I mean, right? So yeah, just the idea of the distinction between slicing his nose and ears with their cruel swords, but then instead of slicing his privates, tearing them out. And then feeding them raw to the dogs, I guess, in front of him because that wasn't enough. I mean, here again, we come to a difference with the Iliad. The Iliad, for all its violence, I don't think focused on the torture of people quite so much. I mean, there are some people who are described as dying painfully, but it doesn't seem to be intentional. Achilles does attempt to mutilate Hector's body, but it's after he's dead. And also in the Iliad, I don't think there are women who are executed in the Iliad. Am I missing anything? I mean, obviously the author of the Iliad does know that when Troy falls, there's going to be some atrocities visited on the Trojan woman. But yeah, it does seem to be a difference between these books. And, again, a point which other critics have made before me. John Green made this point in his video. The Odyssey does seem to be showing a worldview of the patriarchy. I don't know, maybe it's doing it ironically. And again, it all gets back to what you think the author's intentions are. But, these 9 women were killed just for having sex with the suitors. Whereas Odysseus, as he's going around on his journey, is having sex with a whole bunch of women. So John Green makes it a point in his video about the hypocrisy of the patriarchy or patriarchal values. Not to mention the Cicones Island, in which they just took the woman there for sexual pleasure. So these are just... Yeah, the book kind of leaves you with a bad taste in your mouth. And I don't know if that's what the author is trying to do, or if this is just 2 different value systems that are clashing against each other. The modern value system versus I don't really know what I'm supposed to be feeling with this book. I think I've said most of what I want to say here, but that seems like a downer note to end on, doesn't it? Let me just look at my notes here. Do I have anything else? Let's see. There's I think that's it. What a note to end on, huh? That's the danger of doing these reviews unscripted. Is sometimes you finish up right on a note like that. But okay, let me try and redirect a little bit. These books, both of them, are fascinating. there is so much stuff in them, and they both get tedious at times. The Odyssey more so, and there it's incredibly confusing to me to try and figure out what the values of the time were, and what I'm supposed to be feeling with all this violence and stuff like that. But I think they're obviously must reads. There's just so much stuff in them. Not even counting all the influence they've had on everything that got published since then. I mean, as it says in the introduction to these books, these are the first extant works in Western civilization. So this is the cornerstone on which everything else was built. And the fact that I'm having such an emotional reaction against the stuff in this book goes to show, to a certain extent, how engaging it is. Love it or hate it. So definitely read it, and make your own review of it, huh? And we can talk about it from there.